Welcome everyone to another episode of THD Politicking. It's Monday morning. Good morning and welcome to the start of another week. Fair warning, today's topic is a little bit heavy, but it's just something that I recently come into contact with here in the UK, and I've been contemplating whether or not to do this story, to do something on this, but I feel like it's really important as a woman, as a mother, and as a victim of sexual abuse. So, yeah, I'm just going to dive into it. So, we're going to talk about two very infamous cases, one from the UK, Jimmy Savile, and one from the US, Jeffrey Epstein. And we're going to talk about two men who basically built their entire reputations around wealth, charity, influence, and then used those reputations to hide the darkest of crimes. The question is, though, how do they get away with it for so long, and why did the fallout look so different on each side of the Atlantic? Let's start with here in Britain, Jimmy Savile. So, anyone who's grown up in the UK, you probably don't need me to explain who he was, but just in case, he wasn't just famous, he was everywhere. He was one of those larger than life television personalities, a man that had a lot of quirks and eccentricity and an eccentric lifestyle, raising millions for charity, knighted, friends with the royal family, and considered a quote, national treasure, end quote, by BBC and most of the population of the UK. On camera, he was quite quirky, funny, generous, the kind of person who felt untouchable in the best way. But then, after his death in 2011, the mask came off and the truth was horrifying. We're talking hundreds of victims of abuse that spanned decades. And suddenly, the entire country was left asking, how on earth did this happen right under our noses? And the more you look at it, the more chilling it actually gets because there were warning signs. People who spoke up and people who tried to speak up but weren't really heard. But then the institutions like the BBC, the NHS, even the police either missed them, downplayed them, or just quietly moved on. Or maybe it was willful blindness or fear of reputational damage or something, darker that seems to underlie humanity as a whole, protecting powerful people. But whatever the reason, the fallout was absolutely massive. The country was so angry. People felt extremely betrayed, and there were inquiries, reports, recommendations. But even now, years later, a lot of people here will tell you it still feels like the full truth never completely came out. Now, as for me, an American who only vaguely knew the name Jimmy Savile anyway, I was watching this documentary and having conversations with people afterwards about it, and it was shocking to my core just how woven into British culture he really was. And this wasn't like a fringe celebrity that had a few minutes of fame. This was someone that over decades had been a part of so many people's lives. This was the guy. This was the guy that a lot of people grew up with, that a lot of people relied on, that a lot of people really based a certain portion of their belief in humanity on. And that betrayal, that makes the betrayal sting even more. So let's cross the pond for a second because as I was learning about Jimmy Savile, I couldn't help but think about another case that's disturbingly familiar in a lot of respects, the Jeffrey Epstein case. Now, Epstein is a different character. There's no like goofy tracksuits or phrases. He wasn't a huge celebrity, at least as far as the public was concerned. However, the pattern of manipulation and abuse was pretty close to what Jimmy Savile did. He built his life around wealth and connections, Harvard, Wall Street, private jets, celebrities, politicians, and even royalty, yet again. And for years, he used those networks to shield himself from what he was really doing. The 2008 plea deal in Florida is a perfect example. He was facing very serious charges of sexual abuse of a minor, but the deal, negotiated by then prosecutor Alex Acosta, some of you may recognize that name, basically let him walk away with a slap on the wrist. People knew, people talked, but accountability was almost non existent. Then, if you fast forward to 2019, he's arrested again, and then suddenly, just weeks later, he's dead in his jail cell. Officially ruled as a suicide, and we're not going to get into the nuances of that. But the circumstances were quite bizarre, and it lit a fire under some conspiracy theories. But here's where the cultural differences come in. In the States, the Epstein scandal didn't spark a wave of national soul searching like Savile did here in the UK. The American people were outraged just the same as they were here in the UK after finding out all of the atrocities that Savile committed. But power didn't. It turned into this swirl of conspiracy theories and partisan finger pointing in the US, rather than actual accountability for someone who's hurt so many children for so many years. Now, in the UK, Savile was already dead when most of these realizations came to light, so there's very little they could do as far as punishment is concerned. But I remember seeing in the documentary that they removed his headstone. I think they may have even removed his knighthood, and they will no longer play any clips or anything unless it's in the form of some kind of educational, informational documentary on purpose so as to not promote and make light of the really heavy, disgusting things that he did to a lot of children. In the US, it just seemed like everyone wanted to tie Epstein to their political enemy because suddenly he had become a villain amongst the American public and they didn't want to be associated with him. There were some journalists that kept digging and trying to spotlight like victims. There are certain members of Congress and Senate that do want to see justice come to light. But it just seems like the focus keeps drifting back into the spectacle of Epstein himself rather than protecting the victims and giving them a chance for their stories to be heard and real accountability for other people that might be involved to be actually realized. Not that there's any actual spotlight on systems that allowed Epstein to thrive for decades. So when you're putting these two cases side by side, some patterns just really jumped out at me. And that's why I felt so compelled to speak about it. Both men basically built shields out of their status, their wealth, and their networks. Both had countless victims who tried to speak up but were ignored. And in both countries, the institutions that should have protected the people, the children, instead protected their reputations. And that is just unacceptable and reprehensible for both areas, both countries. But the differences are also fascinating in a way because in the UK, the Savile scandal became a story of institutional failure and national shame. And it was recognized, and it continues to be recognized today. People have a lot of distrust in institutions such as the BBC, some of it stemming from that type of scandal, from that specific cover up, whether they knew about it or not. is really irrelevant because for a man who spent so much time on the BBC talking about his accolades, talking about everything that he was doing, to not recognize that something was off when the victims were in his presence, just seems to me anyway like it's unfathomable that somebody couldn't have picked up on something. In the United States, the Epstein scandal is just now a story of complete government distrust, full of conspiracy theories. No one in the public knows what's true, what's not for 100%. And all of the victims have to relive this over and over and over and over again every single day, which is, for any person who is a survivor of any kind of abuse, but particularly sexual abuse, is absolute torture. Savile's story feels kind of like a cultural wound here in the UK, whereas Epstein's feels like just another conspiracy theory that people will argue about on social media until the cows come home, but nothing's ever really going to be done about it. So I wanted to talk about it because to me, the lesson is really simple. Power is going to protect itself at as many costs as it possibly can. Fame and money are always going to act like shields. And culture, the way that society sees the authority, the institutions, the celebrity, is really what determines what happens when that shield finally cracks. So I do wonder what would have happened if Savile had been American. Would he have been stopped any sooner? Would it have even come out if he hadn't died? Excuse me. Would it have come out since he was already dead? Would people have even bothered to acknowledge those atrocities that happened? And if Epstein was British, would the story have played out the same way? Would he still be alive? Would he have ever held any real accountability, or other people held accountability? Now, we are lucky in a sense here in the UK that there is some accountability for some royal involvement, but really overall, the victims still have not been made whole in any way, shape, or form. The Epstein situation makes me completely embarrassed as an American. As I said, I am a woman, I am raising a daughter, and I am a victim of sexual abuse myself. And it is not even close to the extent as some of the stories that I've heard that come out of the Epstein files, but horrific nonetheless. And I couldn't imagine basically being told that I've made up the whole thing, or it's not as bad as I remember, or I'm remembering events wrong on a countless cycle. And I was so distraught and sick to my stomach, literally, at some of the allegations that came out after Jimmy Savile had died, which in some ways was even more horrific because those were sick children. Those were children who had mental illness and had physical ailments that could prevented them from fighting back. And it was a completely different kind of manipulation and abuse on top of sexual abuse. So I'm curious what y'all think about this. Do you see any comparisons? Maybe I'm just drawing conclusions from my own personal experiences, but I am very, very curious what your thoughts are. Please leave them in the comments below. In any event, we have to do what we have to do in order to protect our children. That's the most important thing in the world, in my eyes. If we can't protect our children, what kind of societies are we really? And when we find out that we didn't protect our children, we're not doing any better as a society if we actually don't hold people accountable for the atrocities they commit and put some systems into place to make sure that those atrocities, or at least, I don't know if you can ever control them from happening ever again, but you can definitely mitigate it and try your best. That's all I have for you guys today. I'll talk to you next week.